Okay, welcome everybody to the first workshop conference of the Scottish Privy Council project funded by Leverhulme. Plug. It's really good to have you here, and especially when it's been so difficult to arrange a semi, or what we call nowadays blended or hybrid scenario, where there are some of us actually in the room. Which is nice, but also welcome to those who are listening online as well. And it's great that so many people have, I think it's over 40 people are joining us online, which is absolutely fabulous. Earlier in the year, I gave a seminar at a Stirling session introducing the project, and there were nearly 100 people online listening to it. Now, when was the last time that Alistair Mann had 100 people listening to him giving a paper? So I think that it's not entirely negative that people are joining us online. So anyway, thank you for that. It's been very difficult to keep this project going during COVID. And it has meant a delay in the start date of the project, which was due to start in the spring of last year and ended up starting in October. But we've now recruited a full team who are a good bunch of lads and lasses, and we're obviously going to walk into the sunset at the end of this project, knowing a bit more about the Privy Council of Scotland. One of the things I mentioned in my paper to Athens, an Athens conference last week, was our desire to piggyback on or learn from international studies of councils throughout the globe and to see what they were about in the pre-modern world, or indeed in the modern world as well. But before we start building roofs, we need to build foundations. And the foundations are very much the current state of research on the Privy Council in Scotland. And that's really what this first workshop is about. There's a plan to have a workshop in Dundee next year and a concluding conference or larger conference in Stirling the year after, as the project finishes. And we hope by then to know more. And I imagine that all the speakers today were probably going to say to us that to some degree these papers are a work in progress, right? They're not a finished article at all. But that fits in with the project, because as I said to the team recently, in one of those Alex Ferguson moments that one sometimes has, that we expect more meat on the bone next year, you know, which is certainly true. Okay, anyway, to start things going, we'll ask Alan Kennedy if he would start us going, because Alan MacDonald hasn't arrived yet, which is strange. I do hope he's not online. If he is online, could he message us to say so? And Alan is going to speak to us.
I'll sit over here, Alistair, so they can see me.
Are you sure?
Well, it's just.
Are they going to see you there?
Just thinking where the.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
They'll see me.
Absolutely. Alan's going to speak to us about state formation, criminal prosecution in the Scottish Privy Council during the Restoration. Probably of most of the people in the project, Alan has done more work on the council already, and therefore it is with one somehow takes an intake of breath when you're in his company and say something about the council for fear of that you might be wrong. But anyway, here he is. Alan, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I like the indication that it's more likely that you would be wrong than me, which I'm not sure is an accurate position. But anyway, delighted to be here, and apologies in advance for those of you, principally the project team members who were here last week for the conference. You'll find what I'm about to say today really quite familiar, so apologies. Slightly longer, but familiar nonetheless. Okay, the rise of the state in early modern Europe, as we all know, is one of the most thoroughly worked of historiographical tropes. While conventional discussions often focused on the concept of absolutism, now of course much debated, and the emergence of overweening central administrations, more recent research has permitted historians to think about the state in more complex and creative ways. For example, by exploring the role of social elites or geographical peripheries in legitimising, shaping and sustaining institutional developments. Within these more sophisticated narratives, criminal law can be afforded a prominent role. In part, of course, that's rooted in the Weberian conception that states need to secure a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence and force, meaning that punishing criminals has to become the exclusive privilege of government, broadly defined. Perhaps more importantly, criminal prosecution arguably played a role in entrenching the authority of emergent state structures by ensuring universal subjugation to them, while also allowing the state to map out and police the limits of acceptable behaviour. Historians of England, of course, have been very receptive to these ideas, but in the case of Scotland, conceptualising criminal law as a state-forming agency is problematic, not least because after the Union of 1707 there was no Scottish state in place. But even discounting the problem of 1707, Scotland's early modern legal system has acquired a rather unsavoury reputation for backwardness, viciousness and ineffectiveness. Hardly the raw materials, we might think, for a successful state-forming project. Sorry if I messed up the...
No, someone was saying that they couldn't see the screens.
Oh, right, well, hopefully that. Apologies to people coming in from distance. Hopefully Claire has managed to solve that problem. More pertinently, historians have not been slow to recognise that criminal justice in Scotland was unusually disparate and decentralised, with a great deal of criminal or quasi-criminal prosecution taking place either in church courts or in the various forms of franchise court, maintained by many Scottish landholders until the abolition of heritable jurisdictions in 1747. It's not clear, however, at least to me, that this diffusion of authority diminished the theoretical supremacy of royal justice. And indeed, this primacy was signalled in 1672 by the formation of the High Court of Justiciary, apparently as a supreme criminal court. Diffusion of power and authority was in any case a feature of all aspects of early modern Scotland, but that has not stopped scholars from detecting signs of state formation, especially during and after the adult reign of James VI in late 16th and early 17th centuries. But this emergent Scottish state was different from its more familiar English counterpart, since its bureaucratic underdevelopment militated against the use of office holding and formal participation to meld state with society. Instead, the Scottish state relied upon informal acquiescence. The informal acquiescence and support of powerful social groups, especially the nobility of the church, whose innate authority, sometimes legitimated through office holding, very often not, could be used as a kind of proxy mechanism for state formation, so long as the interests of all groups remained aligned with the government's. I suppose what I'm getting at here is if participatory bureaucracy, if we might call it that, was central to the English model of early modern statehood, working informally through pre-existing social elites was core to Scotland's version. Within this model of an informal participatory state, if I can call it that, there are some embryonic suggestions that criminal courts could play a role analogous to that mapped out for England, in the sense that they help identify those behaviours deemed incompatible with community harmony, while also providing a forum for people to participate in the negotiation of these boundaries and in power relations more broadly. So what I'm seeking to do this morning is to build on those rather tentative foundations by exploring the criminal justice activities of the Privy Council as the government's main executive organ. I'm going to focus on the reigns of Charles II and James VII, and the paper seeks to understand what role the Privy Council played in the prosecution of crime and what consequences this had for criminal justice in Scotland and for the shaping of the Scottish state. I'll begin by assessing the Council's jurisdictional activities as a court of first instance, before then considering its wider importance as an appellate and supervisory body. The exercise will, I hope, demonstrate that the Council calculatedly exploited its judicial role in an effort to forge and sustain the authority of the state with quasi-absolutist ambitions. If you would mind,
Yeah.
that would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, while the origins of the Scottish Privy Council are murky, it is clear that by the late 16th century it had developed a significant role as a court, derived ultimately from the conventional right of the monarch to administer justice. As one commentator sweepingly argued in 1691, citing parliamentary precedent from the reign of James VI, quote, "His Majesty and Council are judges competent to all persons, spiritual and temporal, in all matters." Yet the nature of this extremely broad superiority in practice is unclear. Certainly as a supervisory and appellate body, the Privy Council's remit was potentially very broad. Anybody convicted of a crime in Scotland was entitled to appeal to the Council, and on rare occasions during the Restoration, doing so resulted in the conviction being quashed. The Justice General's Court, for example, found George Graham guilty of stealing a money bond worth £100 sterling from Isabel Seton, Lady Barefoot, in 1663, but he was absolved later that year on the as yet unexplained intervention of the Council. More usually, however, conciliar action was limited to the modification of sentences. Few were as fortunate as James Purdy, who appealed to the Council in 1666 after having been acquitted of usury before the Justice General, but convicted of accepting interest in an irregular way. While not overturning the conviction, the Council ordered that he should not, that no sentence or penalty should be imposed upon him. And incidentally, I just found out yesterday that the reason for doing that was that he had grown up in Poland, and he was Scottish, but had grown up in Poland and was therefore ignorant of the laws of Scotland, which I think is an interesting bit of reasoning. Others had to settle merely for commutations or for other modifications to sentences passed by lower courts. As well as enjoying extensive appellate jurisdiction, the Privy Council exercised a general supervisory function over other courts. Some of this was judicial in character, so that, for example, other jurisdictions might appeal to the Council for guidance or on sentencing or other matters. In 1673, for instance, the Regality Court of Argyll resolved to appeal for advice in the case of John Crawford and Marie McLaughlin, who had been convicted of the capital offence of notorious adultery, that is, adultery that was repeated or particularly flagrant or whatever, incidentally the best named crime in early modern Scotland, but whom the Assize had spared punishment because, as they explained, they were not aware of any precedent for the prescribed punishment of death actually being imposed. Again, an interesting thing. But the Council could also be rather more proactive, most usually by issuing orders for the initiation of specific trials. When, for instance, James Gray and a number of other individuals who were alleged to have murdered William Fraser of Albany were captured at Beaulieu in 1680, the Council instructed that the prisoners be transported to Edinburgh preparatory for trial. Yet if the Privy Council's function was reasonably clear in terms of appeals and supervision, its role as a court of first instance was rather more complex. The College of Justice, established in 1532, gradually cemented its position as the main forum for civil cases, leaving the Privy Council to develop a loosely defined extraordinary jurisdiction, which I'm not going to go into today, or too complicated. In criminal matters, serious offences, especially those known as the 4 pleas of the Crown, namely murder, rape, fire-raising and robbery, were generally heard in the Court of the Justice General, remodelled in 1672, as I said earlier on, as the High Court Justiciary. While lower courts, primarily sheriff courts, justices of the peace courts and the franchise courts, held primary responsibility for most other transgressions. The Council's direct jurisdiction in both civil and criminal affairs, according to its own judgment, lay in, quote, matters of government, wherein councillors were, again, quote, the only competent judges. George Mackenzie of Rosehaw, twice Lord Advocate and arguably the most prominent lawyer of the Restoration period, agreed that the Council's jurisdiction extended only to affairs with direct implications for what he called the public peace. But he attempted to offer rather more detail by arguing that this meant, in practice, that its primary interest was in the crime of a riot. This was a particular offence in Scots law, which Rosehall defined at some length, and I confess not altogether usefully. This is what he said. Quote, "A riot is a breach of the peace committed by oppression or wronging His Majesty's lieges by force and violence. Instances whereof are the dispossessing any of His Majesty's subjects by a convocation of lieges, or otherwise, the affronting of magistrates by raising tumults against them, and so on, where the public is wounded in breaking its peace and private persons are wronged by the prejudice done." Riot, in this rather verbose understanding, was therefore an elastic transgression that potentially overlapped with a large number of other crimes like homicide, theft, robbery, assault, and so on. In the absence of firm jurisdictional divisions, it is often impossible to discern the criteria used to judge which cases had implications for public peace and therefore constituted riots, and which did not. The best we can do, I think, is to make inferences from the Council's judicial activities, and doing so suggests a number of relevant factors. Firstly, the Council often dealt with crimes involving an elite accuser or an elite accused. Secondly, many of its cases blurred the line between civil and criminal action, for example, by involving land disputes that spilled over into violence. Thirdly, and most typically, cases originating before the Council often had distinctly political overtones, for example, involving resistance to government office holders. However, as the discussion that I'm just about to launch into will make clear, I hope, a more generalised explanation may well be that the Privy Council selected the cases it heard from a consciously state-building position, moulding its judicial activities in such a way as to enhance the power of central government or to enforce policy decisions, most obviously related to ecclesiastical structures. Okay. Super. With these issues in mind, it's possible to reconstruct the business of the Restoration Privy Council as a court of first instance, albeit only for the reign of Charles II. The registers for James VII's reign are incomplete. Caution must be exercised, however, since distinguishing between the Council's civil and criminal activities is extremely difficult, largely because the Council, being competent in both, seem to be really quite relaxed about differentiating between them. As a general rule, the cases I've put on the slide here are those which were moved both by the aggrieved parties and by the Lord Advocate acting for the King's interest, although I recognise that that is very far from foolproof methodology. So uncertainty notwithstanding, a total of 648 individual cases and 3,638 separate indictments have been recorded for the Restoration period, and these are broken down by category in this table. I would immediately advise you to completely ignore these numbers. They are very much indicative rather than to be taken literally. Nonetheless, hopefully they'll prove useful, because it is immediately apparent from looking at this that from both perspectives, the Privy Council's business as a criminal court was dominated by religious and broadly political offences, which together made up more than half of both cases and indictments. I don't have time here to discuss some of the categories outlined on the slide, so if you're interested in my musings on property or economic offences, have a look at the article in the English Historical Review, which covers this in more depth. Instead, I just want to zone in, if I can, on the political offences. This slide is even worse, so again, please ignore the numbers and just absorb the patterns. To take the religious side of things first, almost all of the Privy Council prosecutions in this broad area were to do with people resisting the Restoration Episcopalian Church settlement, with conventicling, that is, attendance at illegal prayer meetings, being by far the most commonly heard transgression. Most other religious offences were also in some way connected to anti-Episcopalianism, refusing to take the 1681 Test Act, for example, of which 2 people were indicted, and I think that's up there on the slide. Yes, it is, and I got the number right, that's good. That constituted obviously implicit resistance to the Restoration Church settlement. The centrality of this kind of case is, of course, hardly surprising, since enforcing Episcopalianism was a key policy aim during the Restoration, But that's kind of the point, because in prosecuting nonconformists and conventiclers in particular, the Privy Council was playing its part in advancing that platform, and thereby was advertising its willingness to use criminal justice as a state-building tool. But if religious cases were dominated by a single kind of offence, a rather broader range of political crimes were prosecuted. The most common was, broadly speaking, negligence in public office, which accounted for about 1/5 of political cases and indictments. Duncan Campbell, charged with uplifting the Covenanting-era land tax known as the monthly maintenance from Argyll, was, for instance, cited for embezzling up to 5,000 merks in 1662, not an inconsiderable amount of embezzlement. More typically, accusations of negligence related to allegedly insufficient rigour among public officials in tackling Presbyterian nonconformity. Thus, nearly 30 heritors in New Monkland parish were collectively fined £200 for failing to protect the Episcopalian minister of neighbouring Old Monkland, Michael John Ross, who had been dispatched there in 1675 to preach in the vacant church. He'd been attacked by a hostile crowd and forced to abandon his efforts, apparently without much help from the local landholders. Much of the rest of the Privy Council's political caseload involved crimes that similarly touched upon protecting the integrity and security of public offices. Thus, deforcement involving the abuse, assault or impeding of royal officials was an obvious challenge to government authority, as were cases involving the usurpation of royal authority or misconduct in office, examples of which certainly crossed the Privy Council's desks in this period. The fact that the Council spent a noteworthy proportion of its time prosecuting offences of this character speaks to the institutional underdevelopment of early modern states in general, and of Scotland in particular. Lots of amateur unsalaried officials running around upholding standards, and standards and authority could be difficult. But the very fact that the Council attempted to do so through criminal prosecution speaks to the Scottish state's emerging ambition, I think, to secure control over those structures. Aside from reflecting supervision of public officials, political prosecution also involved crackdowns on more overt acts of disaffection. Cases of treason, rebellion, harbouring rebels, tumult and so on, all represented instances of the Council trying to punish people for explicitly flouting government authority. All this constituted the Council's most overt involvement in trying public offences, but it was also the clearest instance of criminal prosecution being used specifically to shore up government authority. Since the Council, in essence, embodied that authority, its punishment of negligence in office, treason, rebellion, sedition, and so on, inevitably took on a distinctly political and, I think, state-building character. While responding to some criminal complaints brought before it through a trial, the Privy Council decided to deal with others indirectly by means of a judicial commission. That involved delegating the power to try usually specified criminals to a panel of local luminaries, who would therefore become, in effect, temporary custodians of the Council's judicial authority. It is, I think, worth reflecting briefly on these commissions, because they also speak to the role of criminal justice in Scottish state formation, but also as a jumping off point for something else, which I want to talk about shortly. Between 1661 and 1668, therefore, the Privy Council granted a total of 182 judicial commissions, again, the patterns rather than the number we're perhaps more interested in, which I tried to categorise here by alleged offence. By far the most common crime delegated to commissions was, of course, witchcraft, which accounted for just under 50% of the total. That's hardly surprising, since witchcraft was something of a judicial anomaly in that trials generally required Privy Council consent before they could go ahead at all. Equally, of course, one of the biggest of Scotland's witch hunts took place during this period in 1661-2, so the predominance of witch trial commissions is not at all unexpected. But we are also seeing other things like murder, theft and robbery being frequent subjects of judicial commissioning. But what's important about all of this, I think, is that the vast bulk of this kind of activity took place early in our period, especially during the first half of the 1660s. Towards the end of the Restoration, an entirely different twist on this approach of judicial delegation began to emerge. And that involved creating entirely new temporary jurisdictions over defined geographical spans. The two most important examples of this were both in the 1680s, and in both cases they emerged as a response to perceived long-standing domestic headaches. Highland banditry on the one hand, and militant religious nonconformity on the other. In the case of the Highlands, concern about lawlessness and cattle theft caused the Council in 1682 to establish an entirely new jurisdiction known as the Commission for Securing the Peace of the Highlands. Naming a panel of 66 commissioners, later revised to 67, it divided the region into 4 zones, creating in each of them a new justiciary court whose formal competence rivaled that of the High Court in Edinburgh. Now, in the event only one of these divisions, the southernmost one, which was centred on Argyll, enjoyed any significant success in tackling crime, and even then only really in the first 2 years of its existence. Nonetheless, the emergence of the Highland Commission demonstrates the willingness of the Council to institute entirely new jurisdictions in a bid to tackle certain law and order issues. It also reflects, I think, a clear relationship between criminal jurisdiction and state building, since the creation of the new Highland courts, over which councillors claimed explicit and exclusive rights of supervision, was overtly intended to help extend the reach and realise the goals of central government. The Highland Commission was conceptualised and presented as plugging a jurisdictional gap, and as such it made little attempt to bypass existing local power structures, instead attempting to absorb them into the system. The other new jurisdiction created in the 1680s was of a rather different stamp. In April 1683, the entirety of Scotland south of the River Erne was divided into 6 zones, within each of which a circuit court was empowered to sit during the following summer to try both non-conforming Presbyterians and covenanting rebels still at large following the recent rebellion of 1679. Although most of the 61 people specifically named in the commission were local landholders, their authority was to be shared with privy councillors themselves, as well as with all existing judges and, interestingly I think, military officers. This jurisdictional innovation was explicitly justified on the grounds that too many existing magistrates demonstrated, quote, remissness in discharge of their duties, allowing rebels and non-conformists to operate without consequences. This measure then, and others like it, reflected the breadth of the Privy Council's competence in terms of creating these new structures for law and order purposes, as well, crucially, as its willingness to use that power, not just to uphold justice, but boldly to enforce political conformity. So, by the Restoration then, the Privy Council had, in both theory and practice, carved out a significant role in Scottish criminal justice, thanks to its position as the supreme executive organ of government, I should say. That supremacy was most obvious at one remove. Wide appellate jurisdiction allowed it to review verdicts and sentences from lower down the court hierarchy. And similarly, broad rights of supervision saw the Council intervene in various ways to coordinate and direct the course of justice. That same dynamic can be traced in the Council's commissioning strategy, since in delegating the authority required for specific trials and actions, or in creating new jurisdictions for law and order purposes, councillors demonstrated the judicial supremacy they enjoyed by virtue of channeling royal authority. The Council's latitude, though, was functionally narrower as a court of first instance. Although by some accounts theoretically competent in almost anything, the general expectation, confirmed by close analysis of day-to-day activities, was that their attention should be restricted to actions with some bearing on political or public affairs, with such cases being classified under that very useful catch-all title of riot. The rigidity of this restriction should not be exaggerated, of course, since the very broadness of riot as a crime permitted some complaints with few or no identifiable public implications to be heard, particularly in terms of interpersonal transgressions. Again, the English Historical Review article reflects on this a bit more deeply. So reconstructing the Restoration and Privy Council's judicial activities ties into a wider discussion about the role of criminal prosecution in the state-building processes of the early modern period. Partly, that's a question of participation. Criminal cases were generally initiated by private individuals, and as the evidence I've tried to present today, I hope makes clear, this generally held true for the Restoration and Privy Council. A wide range of private grievances were heard, and moreover it is clear that one did not have to be part of the elite to have access to conciliar justice. Just to give you an example, while the most august peers of the realm could appeal to the council, so too could somebody like John Pearson, who was an apprentice apothecary, who complained to the council over a piece of false imprisonment in 1681. Equally, of course, Privy Council processes drew in a wider pool of individuals as witnesses, and the council dealt with cases from every part of Scotland. You can find cases originating from Shetland and others originating from Kirkcudbrightshire in this period. In its interactions with these people, the council offered a shared forum for justice that provided a sense of commonality, but it also, and perhaps more importantly, gave ordinary Scots, or a lot more Scots than just the elite, a stake in the structures of the state. There is, however, an important caveat that must be attached to this picture of wide participation and penetration. In 1661, the Lord Advocate, acting in the public interest, was co-accuser in about a quarter of cases and sole initiator of none. By 1685, he was named among the complainants in fully 77% of cases and the sole accuser of nearly 1/5 of the time. Now, while the reasons for the Lord Advocate's interest in particular cases is sometimes difficult to understand, the overall trend there suggests a shift in emphasis over time, so that by the end of the Restoration, conciliar prosecution was more often initiated directly by the Crown and tended more closely to reflect the government's political priorities than perhaps it had at the start of the Restoration. The increasing proactivity of the Lord Advocate needs to be viewed in its wider context, and doing so highlights, I think, another link between Privy Council prosecution and state formation. Across Britain and Ireland, the reigns of Charles II and James VII and II, and the 1680s in particular, were marked by persistent anxiety about a potential return to the political disintegration and turmoil of the Civil War period. In Scotland, this spawned a political culture that valued the preservation of order above all other goals and identified strong monarchical government as the best means of achieving that. While that did not necessarily overturn the sort of participatory state framework I outlined earlier on, it did represent an effort to introduce a more intrusive and controlling ethos. The Privy Council's judicial activities, I would submit, flowed from that overarching framework. Prosecution of conventicling and related challenges to the Erastian religious settlement of the 1660s was the most obvious embodiment of that posture. But across its business, the council betrayed growing determination to use its judicial powers as a means of shoring up government authority, protecting or supervising social and office-holding elites, and enforcing policy decisions. The criminal law, in short, to sum up this in one sentence, was increasingly being used by the Privy Council as the tool of a government that displayed distinctly and growing authoritarian tendencies. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al. That's superb. Thank you. A great start. We'll do questions at the end of each session, okay? Because I don't think we can. It makes sense to kind of do that. And if I can draw a line between the two Alans and what their papers are, which I might have done earlier, but one of us was late on the pitch. But we're not Alan. Anyway. One of the reasons for putting these papers by each other, not just because they are members of the team, senior members at that, but also because it gives the context of the council going into the period of the project. And we get a bit more of that from from John Young this afternoon, but in a different way. But that's why they're there. So thank you very much. That was interesting. I liked your idea about not getting absorbed by the figures, but looking at the trends. Must remember that. Next time I look at inflation. Anyway. Yes, please. Anyway, our next speaker, Al Donald, is the co-eye on the project with me, the leader at Dundee on the Privy Council project. And perhaps we can now, after a general trend paper, this I suppose focuses more on an individual's role in this case. And his paper is the Privy Council in the Union of 1603 and an elderly nonentity, which is no criticism of the oldest person on the project, I hasten to add. Alan, thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for my late arrival, folks. It was entirely due to the propensity of Fife's farmers to check their watches at 8 o'clock in the morning and take to the roads with large pieces of machinery. It took me half an hour to get from Strathmiglo to Milnathort, which was a bit hellish. But there you are, here I am. And as I walked in, I saw Julian, and 2 minutes later, Keith walked in. I thought, oh, right, this is going to be interesting. So here goes. This is very much a kite flying sort of paper. It's quite speculative, it's quite raw, it's very much work in progress. So bear with me as I speculate. I also apologies to those online. I don't know whether they get to see my face. It looks like they do, the poor souls. I don't have a PowerPoint, it's just me. So you'll just have to deal with that. The idea for this paper began some years ago when I was working on the Treasurer's accounts, initially searching for previously unidentified conventions of the estates, then shifting my focus onto the broader issue of the impact of absentee monarchy, or whatever one wants to call it, on the centre's engagement with the political community at large. In the course of that work, one detail caught my attention. That was a change in the role of John Graham, 3rd Earl of Montrose, from Chancellor to King's Commissioner in 1604. This led me to ponder the fact that here was a figure who held the highest office in government and held it for nearly 6 years, but about whom almost nobody has had anything much to say. My purpose in focusing on the 3rd Earl of Montrose is not to exalt him as some genius behind the government of Scotland during the years immediately before and after the regal union. Such an approach has been favoured by one prominent historian of early modern Scotland with regard to a number of individuals like John Maitland of Thirlestane, Alexander Seton, Earl of Dunfermline, William Graham, Earl of Menteith, and to an extent James VI himself. But it's not the approach I personally would favour. My intention, rather, is to bring the Earl of Montrose to the fore to pose some questions, both about what happened in the government of Scotland between about 1598 and about 1607, and perhaps even more importantly, about what did not happen. As Julian Goodair has noted, and surely none of us involved in this project would disagree, most questions about how Scotland was governed tend sooner or later to lead back to the Privy Council. The Earl of Montrose was appointed President of the Privy Council in December 1598. This is a role that was not yet one of the standard set of the great offices of state. That development would not occur until the reign of Charles I, when, ironically, it was my subject's son, the 4th Earl of Montrose, who was appointed to that role. It's not clear what James VI was exactly up to in December 1598, but the promotion of Montrose to the presidency of the council took place at the same time as the reconstitution of the Privy Council, reducing its size in an apparent effort to make it more streamlined and professional. Having ruled without a chancellor since October 1595, It's hard not to see this reconstruction as, in part at least, preparation for absentee rule. During 1598, James had been sending ambassadors to various European powers to seek their support in case any snags might arise with his succession to the English throne. So it's clear that his mind was turning to the English succession. Things had clearly changed in the king's mind since, in the aftermath of the death of John Maitland of Thirlestane, Chancellor from 1586 until 1595, James had said he was resolved no more to use great men as chancellors, but only such as he could correct and were hangable. This does seem a little odd, given that Maitland was hardly a great man in the contemporary sense. While he was a peer, he was only a lord rather than an earl, and moreover, his title came as a reward for his service to the crown, rather than before he became chancellor, for he was the younger son of a laird. Nevertheless, the reconstitution of the Privy Council in 1598 marks a significant departure. It's not absolutely clear how the Privy Council was chaired during the intervening 3 years, but it seems that the king himself took on that role more often than not. After over 3 years of doing this, a combination of an eye on the English succession and fatigue with the hard work of it all, perhaps, persuaded him that it was about time to return to having some sort of prime ministerial figure to head his government, or at least to chair the executive. But there's another intriguing aspect to this. Not much more than a month after his appointment as President of the Privy Council, that office vanished once again, as Montrose was appointed Chancellor. Was James genuinely reluctant to fill the highest office in the kingdom, but was persuaded by Montrose or by others to take the extra step? And why Montrose? John Graham had been around for quite a while, having first sat on the Privy Council in 1571 in his early 20s, and having been treasurer briefly in the mid-1580s. He was involved in the factional manoeuvrings of the 1570s and 80s, tending to favour a more conservative or royalist stance, but generally exhibiting a tendency to go with the flow. He was an occasional but not a frequent attender at meetings of the Privy Council throughout the period before 1598. The gap without a chancellor between Maitland and Graham is important, and I think requires a longer pause for reflection than it's previously received. After all, this was the first time for over 80 years that the office had been vacant for more than a few months. This surely makes it difficult to dismiss the significance of the appointment of Montrose, firstly as President, then as Chancellor, as Maurice Lee in particular sought to do, dismissing Montrose, this is where my title comes from, as an elderly nonentity. And I'd like to pause here as well, just to talk about this, the epithet elderly. Montrose was only just 50 when he was appointed Chancellor, which is, he was only about 6 months older at his appointment to Chancellor than Alexander Seton was 5 years later when he was appointed Chancellor as Montrose's successor. And if you look at the other office holders, Montrose's age is certainly nowhere near out of the ballpark. It's pretty much close to the average point in someone's life at which a great office like that comes to them. It's not just Lee, though, as the consensus appears to follow his view, albeit perhaps a little less cruelly. Historians generally omit to mention or comment on Montrose's chancellorship at any length at all. Keith Brown said he was unsuccessful as Chancellor because he was, in the words of one contemporary, altogether devoid of learning, which Brown describes as an exaggeration that nevertheless contains an element of truth. As Julian Gurrier observed, however, the Chancellor's role was primarily political rather than legal, as the Lord President of the College of Justice was the one who actually presided over the judiciary. On the other hand, Brown took the view that Chancellors did require a significant level of legal competence, which was well beyond what most lawyers ever attained, far less unqualified nobles. Oh dear, what is one to think? But let's not dwell too long on that problematic issue, except to observe that most chancellors during the preceding decades were neither graduates nor lawyers, and it's not clear if even John Maitland of Thirlestane was either of those things himself. We know he did study at university, but whether he got a degree and whether any of that study involved the law seems uncertain. Anyway, if the kingdom had managed without a chancellor for so long, why appoint a nonentity to the role? One explanation might be that it was a good way of dampening down division at court. Give the role to a nobody that nobody particularly likes, but nobody actively dislikes, and nobody's nose will be put very far out of joint. Montrose is thus framed as the Theresa May, or for older viewers, the John Major of the case, given high office because all the other options are worse. But unless we have good evidence that that's the case, which we obviously do with Major and May, this explanation for Montrose's appointment is at best unproven. Indeed, if Montrose was made Chancellor to avoid giving another powerful individual precedence over everyone else in Scotland and he wasn't an effective politician, why wasn't someone else more capable appointed as President of the Council under him to carry on the actual work of heading what was, after all, the key executive arm of government? While this would allow Montrose to save face by retaining the honour of the role of Chancellor. After all, the Court of Session, nominally headed by the Chancellor, already had a Lord President at this point in Alexander Seton, Lord Fyvie, who continued in that role and would later succeed Montrose as Chancellor, and himself be succeeded by a new Lord President. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The appointment of Montrose as President of the Council in 1598 and then Chancellor a month later meant that both major organs of central government and justice, the Court of Session and the Privy Council, had someone in charge of them as a permanent role. Everyone knows that Seton was a highly intelligent person with legal expertise. Very little, however, is known about Montrose, although there doesn't seem to be any evidence of formal education, let alone study at university. Far less specialist study in the law. Yet in 1598, the king decided that this was the man to head his Privy Council, and early in 1599 to be Chancellor. Before he became Chancellor, Montrose had, as I said, attended council meetings occasionally. Whilst adherents are not entirely reliable as a guide, given that they don't survive for every council meeting, he is recorded as having attended only 19 times in the 6 years before his promotion to the Chancellorship. In the next 4.5 months, however, he attended 30 times, and as far as can be discerned, that level of diligence continued until a frustrating and lengthy gap in surviving official council records occurs after February 1603. It is certainly the case that nobody attended more frequently than Montrose in the period of over 4 years between his being appointed as Chancellor and the departure of the King. If nothing else, he should be commended for his sheer diligence. Clearly, he took the role seriously, becoming effectively a full-time officer of state, spending almost all of his time in Edinburgh. While the King did continue to attend council meetings, the frequency of his attendance declined compared to previous years, and he was absent from around half of the surviving adherents in the period after Montrose's appointment. So it seems reasonable to suppose that James was content to leave the council under the direction of his Chancellor, who seems to have run quite a tight ship. In the first few months under his leadership, individual councillors required explicit permission to remain absent for specified periods, and one councillor, the Earl Marshal, was even kicked off the council in May 1599 for missing 4 meetings after the expiry of such a licence to remain absent. While it's true that no fulsome praise is recorded for Montrose's performance as Chancellor in contemporary sources, perhaps it'd be more accurate to say no praise, it's equally true that nobody marvelled at his appointment or suggested that he was some sort of stooge, as far as I can tell. Perhaps he was not a dynamic political operator with a forceful personality. That much seems clear. But maybe he was a really good administrator and a very effective chair of the council. Perhaps the lesson of Montrose's career is that the thankless donkey work of government needs to be done, and would be better done, by a John Major than a Boris Johnson. Nevertheless, after almost 6 years as Chancellor, Montrose was replaced. The next transition in his status in 1604 is perhaps of even greater significance, at least symbolically, and potentially in practical terms too. It has, to be sure, been portrayed as moving an ineffective office holder into a purely honorific position, to save face, while replacing him as Chancellor with the most able man in the kingdom, Alexander Seton, Lord Fyvie, later Earl of Dunfermline. So let's look at this in a little more detail. First of all, this cabinet reshuffle has consistently been misrepresented by historians who describe Montrose's new role, now that he was no longer Chancellor, merely as standing in for the King as his commissioner in Parliaments. But there was more to it than that. In February 1604, he was indeed appointed as the King's Commissioner to a specific Parliament while he was still Chancellor, with Alexander Seton appointed to deputise for him as Chancellor in Parliament, because the role of the Chancellor was to chair Parliament. However, in December 1604, he was appointed as James's Commissioner General in Scotland. In other words, he was the King's permanent representative, not the occasional appointment for individual parliaments, but a constant appointment as the King's representative. In this role, because he stood for the person of the King, he had precedence above even the Chancellor. Thus his name continued to be listed first in all Privy Council and parliamentary sederents until illness removed him from public life in 1607, before his death the following year. In this role, Montrose presided over parliaments and conventions of the estates, and received all new patents of nobility issued by the King, inaugurating these new peers to their titles. While this might have made him little more than a national Lord Lieutenant, we should return to his role in Parliament, for the King's Commissioner in Parliament was a great deal more than just a mouthpiece for the royal will, and an important, though essentially powerless, facilitator of the ceremonial processes of Parliament. While the Chancellor indeed chaired Parliament, just as the King himself had done before 1604, perhaps most crucially, he also ratified the legislation by touching each paper with the sceptre after it had been read, voted and passed in Parliament, thus making it law. In the Parliament of 1604, the significance of this role turned out to be considerable, as we shall see in a moment. There is, however, one more observation to be made about Montrose's new office that has not received any consideration at all, as far as I am aware. The office of Commissioner General in Scotland was both unprecedented and ephemeral, which is perhaps why so few have noticed that it even existed. Yet here we have James VI, in the immediate aftermath of the Union of the Crowns, creating a new office, the like of which had never existed before during a royal majority, and under a monarch who was compos mentis. Regents, or guardians, or governors had been appointed in the past due to the legal incapacity of a monarch because of their minority, as happened with James VI himself and most of his predecessors, or because of incapacity, as happened with Robert II. This was new and different though. An adult monarch with full mental capacity was apparently appointing a vicegerent. We should remember that in the Scottish context, commissioner means representative. When a borough or a shire appointed a commissioner to Parliament, that person had full, free and plain power to act on behalf of those who had chosen him. Now, while I'm not suggesting that Montrose was explicitly such a plenipotentiary, it's important for us to remember what contemporaries understood a commissioner to be. A hint of Montrose's style and of the potential that existed, albeit briefly, for the role to become more than it did, is to be found at the Parliament of 1604. That session of Parliament did two things that had not been part of the King's plan. First of all, it changed some of the King's nominees for the Union Commission. But more significantly, it passed an act excluding ecclesiastical affairs from the remit of the Union Commission. That act was, as far as we can make out, introduced during the session by the Earl of Morton. It then passed through the Articles and was approved by the Estates, following which Montrose, as King's Commissioner, touched it with the sceptre to make it the law. By the time the King knew of it, it was already the law, and he could do nothing about it. Perhaps James was not bothered. Had he been, it's unlikely he would have made Montrose's role as his representative in Scotland a permanent one later that year. Nevertheless, Montrose had presided over the first post-Union Parliament, and in that capacity had allowed it to chart its own course, apparently without reference to the monarch. The fact that the role only ever had one incumbent, for after Montrose died in November 1608 no successor was appointed, has been crucial in its having been largely ignored by historians. But just because an experiment failed or came to nothing doesn't mean that it isn't worth exploring the motives and intentions of those who devised it. I'm not suggesting that this will necessarily transform our understanding of what was going on in the mind of James VI and his closest advisors in government in the immediate aftermath of the Union, merely that it is an unexplored and unexplained moment in the development of the Scottish state, a path not followed but a path embarked upon nevertheless. This is work in progress, as I mentioned. There is much more to do by way of research. I still need to look at some important sources, most notably English ambassadors' correspondence in the Calendar of State Papers. And it could be that this paper becomes more a study of pre-Union than post-Union government. Still, I'm convinced that there's something to be learned about Government of Scotland in general, and the role of the Privy Council in particular, from an examination of the career of this elderly nonentity. Thank you.
Why don't we try and form a little cabal and see if we can see if we can all be seen at the same time. Yeah. That should function. Oh, this looks almost normal. Right. Questions. Now, how are we going to engage with the online dudes?
I'm monitoring people if they want to put questions in on the chat, so I can relay them, but equally people can just unmute their mics. And
Yeah, so you're welcome. You end up looking. You're welcome online. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? To ask questions if you wish, so that the floor is open. Just to remind you that this session is to contextualise the Privy Council, and I think institutionally and in terms of personality, both of these papers give us something to chew on, and especially about transition, the Union of 1603 and the Restoration period, and remembering that the revolution, which is our transition, that we have to bear in mind, is also a contrast as well. Anyway, questions? Anybody? Good.
Shall I start with?
Yeah, please.
There's no other takers. I've actually got lots of questions which I'll try and restrain myself. Yeah, two fascinating papers. Yeah, I've sort of taken lots of notes. There's a lot of interesting material. And could I just ask Alan?
I'm grateful for that.
Alan Kennedy. First of all, I'd like to just salute your suggestion that we should try and identify the best named crime. Notorious adultery, quite a good one. Another candidate would be Hainsucken. Yeah. But anyway, riot. I tend to see that as something that's coming from England. I mean, or maybe just, nobody cares where it came from, but they find it useful. I think there's something in my writing somewhere that says this emerges in the early 17th century. I mean, and the equivalent previous Scottish crime is probably convocation of lieges in arms. But yeah, we do so need a study of riot, and I think that you know, if you or somebody connected with the project could really nail that, you know what they intend to mean by riot, or how riot appears in the discourse. And you know, you're absolutely right. You know, it's a very sort of fluid term, as indeed it is in England too. Yeah, I would just love to see more about that. So just, I don't know if that's even a question, but you know, I'd be interested in your thoughts as to whether this could be a key to unlock some of the mystery.
Yeah, I mean, riot's fascinating, and I think that I read out the definition here that Mackenzie of Rosehall gives, which is a definition that means nothing at all. It's just a collection of words, and I think the origins of the term, it's earlier than I was focusing on. It's already established by the time the Restoration comes along. But what it seems to just be is riot is anything we choose to call riot because we have an interest in looking at this case or something. So I'm really not clear on the process of how something becomes classified as a riot. It's really, it seems to just appear, these cases appear in the Privy Council register kind of fully formed. I think you'd have to use some kind of micro-study approach to try and trace particular instances of it. I think basically the way I would understand it really is as an extremely useful tool that the government, in this case particularly the Privy Council, seizes on in order to give it the ability to get involved in whatever it chooses to get involved in. Because there really doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reasons. A lot of crimes that are classified as riot also appear in, for example, the High Court. If you look at their books of journals, exactly the same type of offence it seems, but it's not a riot and therefore it goes to the High Court, and I'm really not clear on why that happens. All of which is a very wordy way of saying I don't know the answer to that question. And I agree with you. I think getting a better handle on how this offence gets established and how it's used and understood beyond Mackenzie's rather sort of wordy attempt to do so would be a really useful approach. If we could do that on the project, that'd be great.
Could I ask just a sort of supplementary question in response to that? There's a sort of possibly a sort of procedural, and this may be relevant to the project. There's some procedural or evidential issue in that I'm not sure how far the Privy Council records debates or what in the High Court would be called pleadings. And if you get written pleadings, and if you've got a defence advocate writing a great screed about why this isn't a right, you would get a much better sense of where the debate lay. But the Privy Council doesn't usually do that, does it? It doesn't allow defence advocates to plead before it.
Not that I've seen. Certainly not in the registers and the Act or decree. And maybe, we've been, members of the project have been diving into the miscellaneous boxes that are hidden away in the national records recently. Maybe there'll be something in there that.
Yeah. So how does the debate get conducted? Something that you guys
have you seen anything like that?
Not on riots in particular. It's funny thinking with this back and forth. I keep thinking, I wish Laura was here because this is exactly the kind of stuff that she's particularly interested in pursuing. But no, I haven't seen anything in the boxes on riots.
So there is a large amount of miscellaneous material in boxes in the national records, which we've been gradually looking at. We may not be able to get all the way through it, but and Laura and Claire have been digitising material when they can, and which is separate from the register. So we may find material like this. We're not sure.
The other option is that there might be the odd case where you could piggyback on the High Court, because very occasionally something that will begin in the High Court will be pinched by the Privy Council. So perhaps in their records you might find these kind of pleadings before it becomes a riot. I don't know. I couldn't point to a specific instance of that actually happening, but at least it's a possibility that we might be able to explore down the line.
We have two questions from the chat, which I can relay now.
Yeah, please do.
So the first question is from Lorna Kinnaird, which is a general one, just asking what sources did you consult to gain the initial information / material?
Is this me or both of us?
Both of you, I think.
Do you want to go first?
Sources. I think for me, very initially it was the Treasurer's accounts, because it alerted me to this interesting new job that was created for Montrose, and then it was the Privy Council register itself. That's where most of my investigation in recent weeks has been conducted.
Yeah, and for me, largely this comes from the register of the Privy Council, both the printed version. I also had a look at the manuscript version, but some of the material in here also comes from the High Court's So it's really melding those two plus supplementary other stuff that seemed to.
But there's also the Highland Commission material, which is a separate.
It is. It's classified. The National Records classifies it as part of the Privy Council papers for some reason. Seems a kind of strange classification to me. But yeah, I'd looked at that previously.
Yeah.
PhD, so kind of piggyback on that. That's an example.
If you talk to them nicely, you can get a CD of it. So I would.
Well, I struggle to give you the CD anymore because I've lost that. But I have digital.
Oh, I've still got it. If you talk to me nicely, I'll give you a copy of it.
I've got it in other digital formats, but not the CD anymore.
Lorna says thank you, and then we have a question from Stephanie Dropulich. Stephanie, I'm really sorry if I've said your last name wrong. Her question is for Alan, and she says that both, Alan Kennedy, both were extremely interesting. But Alan Kennedy wondered if you could comment on the nature of the prosecutions which are coming before the council at first instance. Did you notice a change in the remit of criminal libels, e.g. a change in nature in the definitional constraints of these crimes? And a query regarding the quantification that you used for the slide concerning indictments and cases. Stephanie's wondering how you define a case.
Yeah, that's incidentally that problem of which Alan is one that we face every day. Every one of us should change your name. I don't know. Anyway, I mean, take the second thing first. There is a good reason why I encouraged listeners to that paper not to take the figures too literally, because they are impressionistic. Basically, the approach I try to take is that a case is I classified as sort of a defined process, if you like. So a particular riot or a particular convocation of the legions or something. The reason that figure is lower than the indictments figure is because all of these cases, and all of them, a lot of them will have multiple people who are indicted simultaneously as part of the same process. So you end up with, you can have two cases, separate processes, but 50 indictments because they have multiple people. In terms of the nature of the processes, the nature of the prosecutions, that was a rather more technical question than my brain can cope with. But if I can try to address it, I think the basic trend that you can observe, I think, across the Restoration, if you look at the nature of the cases the Privy Council is trying, is essentially a narrowing. The Council becomes increasingly more and more interested in a smaller range of offences, particularly prosecuting any form of Presbyterian nonconformity. That's particularly conventically, but other stuff too, and also those kind of political offences. So I think the profile you're observing is from the start of the Restoration. You have, to put this crudely, what looks like more just a standard law and order thing. These are offences that are being brought before us which have an implication for the public peace, whatever the case might be. Let's look at it. By the end, I think you can detect a much more overt tendency to say, right, these are the cases that we want to try because they are they help the government to establish its political programme or to attain its political goals. And I think that's the point I was trying to get across in the paper. We're seeing a narrowing of the types of offences because of that aim that the Privy Council is clearly pursuing. So that probably doesn't answer the question because I'm not a legal historian, but it's the best I can do, unfortunately.
Excellent. Anybody else? Keith?
So a question for each, if that's all right. With Montrose, I have a vague memory of writing somewhere that most aristocrats, top noblemen, weren't all that bothered with these sorts of jobs. Why do it? And I guess for Montrose, then why do it? There's no great ideological drive. He's this sort of boring middle of the road guy. So he's quite poor, doesn't have much of a following. And I can't remember. Does he get much of a reward from this? He's not.
2000.
That's it.
Yeah.
Not great.
It's the top whack for a government job. So.
And you don't know if he's doing anything on the side, as they all were.
I haven't found anything else yet. I mean, the other thing about him, he gets other things to do. I mean, he's not just, he's made Chancellor of the University of St Andrews, he's sent a troubleshooting mission to Glasgow, there's a dispute there. So, you know, he's busy and he's given, you know, it's more than just a sort of, let's put this person who's a very senior noble, but not up to much into this job and just to keep things quiet. He is given other sort of important troubleshooting, mediation type roles, which does, again, it suggests that he's got some ability.
Yeah.
I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, you go to Calderwood, you go to Melville, you've got virtually nothing to say about it, which maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And I've certainly met people who late in life decide that they want to do things that you would never have expected them to do in the past. And then, Alan, on the council business, what's the process of, you're some guy in Galloway or Angus or whatever, and you've got a gripe. How do you sort of think, I'm going to take this to the Privy Council, and how do you do it? How do you? What's the process? Leaving aside the stuff the Lord Advocate initiates, and how do people in localities gauge their confidence in that process? People don't complain to the police unless they think they're going to be listened to. So how is that sort of disseminated such that people in the localities are going, well, back to the council, they're good lads, they'll sort this out for us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, nice to see you. Although on the other side, that's the problem with having senior scholars and they zone in on the weaknesses, because that is one of the things I'm not sure about. It is observable. You can sort of understand why a very senior peer might go to the council. There's a thing, these are my mates. This is a truncated process. It's not as burdensome as going through the High Court, and it's also likely to, or you might assume it would be more sort of professional than going to a local court or whatever. For people lower down, I think it is I'm unsure as to why some of them would go to the council as opposed to the High Court. It might just be very idiosyncratic issues about they happen to, I don't know, be the tenant of somebody who's on the council or something like that, or they've been advised by somebody they happen to know that the council is a useful place to go. But I'm really not sure. I don't know if anybody else has it as, Julie's hands, or maybe you've got a better idea of this than I do.
Yeah. I think the key people, and they're people who we know very little about, are the clerk to the council and the clerk to the council's servant, who will probably be somebody with legal knowledge of some kind. I've tried to track this in one or two witchcraft cases, but what I think happens is that the petitioner goes to the clerk to the council's servant. The clerk to the council's servant actually reads the paperwork and sort of gets a sense of where this one's going to go. And if he thinks it ought to be heard or it's going to go somewhere, he will tell the clerk, and the clerk may well, let's hope the clerk, agrees with his servant, but if the clerk then thinks this is going to go somewhere, he will then take it to the council. And what we don't get, of course, is where the servant goes, nah, nobody's going to listen to that. Yeah. Or where the clerk himself says to the servant, nah, nobody's going to listen to that. So when you look at the successful ones, you've got to be imaginatively looking for the failed ones, but there's a real problem of them not minuting.
That makes sense, but what was stated before,
yeah.
Do you need a notary in the locality, or do you go to the Justice of the Peace, or is it the Sheriff, or who's the go-to person in the locality?
Keith, I think you can go directly from your locality to as long as you can get to Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Well, the case I looked at was in East Lothian.
Yeah, that's fine. But the problem is that the people outside of the elite who can't do that.
Well, you need a sponsor, or you need somebody, local noble or landlord or local borough council that's going to say, yeah, we agree with this, or there's a letter supplied to say we support this. Yeah. I don't know, but there's, again, this is probably down to your deep throat miscellaneous boxes of material. I know that. I know, but yeah.
Although maybe in private hands, because the clerk to the Privy Council may just have walked away with his papers.
But no, I agree that there's something that's often puzzled me is if you've got a case of a famous one, for example, you mentioned, there's often no obvious reason as to why you should be petitioning the council for that, because classifying as right rather than the High Court, for example. I think that stage of deciding where to petition, it might be the best I can come up with, and this more applies to elites than anything else, is that the Privy Council processes are truncated, they're not as long-winded as High Court ones, and they also seem to be slightly more favourable to whoever happens to be petitioning. So there's a trick that I think Mackenzie of Rosehall moans about this in his legal treatise, is that when you apply to the council, particularly for a form of process known as a precognition, kind of mini trial, almost like a scoping the details. What you can do if the council grants you that is you then get to set the date of when the precognition hearing happens. So what you do is you set the date and a day the other party can't get there. So the council says, oh well, they didn't turn up, therefore we're going to find in your favour. So I don't know if there's a sense of the processes, because they're more underdeveloped or more manipulatable, malleable. Perhaps that might be something to do with that. But again, that's something that you can't see your apprentice apothecary knowing that and engaging with those kind of tricks. So
it's not just the apprentices, the apothecaries, because some of those petitions are from imprisoned witches. You know, they're female, they're imprisoned, you know, they're probably peasants, but they somehow managed to get their case before the council.
Yeah, so there's a lot there for us to do.
Yeah.
Two more questions in the chat. One from Derek Johnston, and this is another for Alan Kennedy. Sorry, Alan. What proportion of cases were not resolved? So some were referred back to other courts or just dropped for a variety of reasons. Yeah, what's going on?
Well, I can't give you a specific proportion. It's not uncommon. Most of these cases that I talk about are resolved. There's some kind of conclusion, either the cases the persons get punishment usually, but there are cases where the council will decide, you know, we'll hear all the evidence, and then this actually isn't a case for us. Go to the Court of Session or go back to the Bailey of Kukubri or something like that. That can happen. There's also some where the complainer, the person raising the petition or complaint, doesn't come to insist. It's very rare, as far as I can remember, in the Privy Council. That happens quite a lot in the High Court, and presumably in other courts too. The pursuer will not appear, and therefore the case is deserted. It doesn't happen so much with the Privy Council, and there will be a few as well where the council decides there's no case to answer and abandons the case. But that doesn't happen very much in the Privy Council. So if something comes before the Privy Council, if I remember, it usually comes to some kind of fruition. So that the rates of desertion and failure of processes are much lower than in formal, more specialist legal jurisdictions.
And second question from Lorna again, more of a general question. Do we have a hierarchy chart of how the Privy Council operated and the relationships between other jurisdictions? It sounds like a very useful thing to have.
It would be useful. I think it might be impossible because the only way you can have a hierarchy is if jurisdictions are to some extent clear, and I think they're not. The big problem that I faced in this paper, I think one of the problems we will face in this project, is I don't think anybody really knows exactly where the jurisdiction of one body ends and the other starts. There's a rough sense. I mean, take the High Court with the 4 pleas of the Crown. That's obviously within the remit of the High Court. That doesn't stop appearing in other courts, legality courts, for example. It doesn't stop the other types of cases appearing before the High Court. And I think the same happens with the Privy Council. So I would love to be able to produce a hierarchy.
I think it's difficult when you have institutions like the Privy Council and the Parliament that actually can do what they want.
Yeah.
So they don't always intervene or interfere in certain jurisdictions, but if they wish to do so, they can.
Yeah.
So you've got this kind of problem. So a schematic of this is likely to be in many dimensions, and it's something that we have to work on. I mean, it's my contribution to this project is supposed to be writing a history of the Privy Council, and I've thought about how I might tackle it in this particular area, and I suspect there will be many muddied waters in the process. So, interesting question. Can I just finish with my own question? Is that possible? Is somebody else wanting to
That's all the
Oh,
questions.
excellent.
from the chat.
I can ask questions all day.
No, well, we have to stop. No, well, I can't, but I'd like to ask Alan McDonald a question. I feel rather sorry for here, in some respects. But linking it, because Julian's question about riot is quite interesting in one respect, which is the kind of contrast relationship between the English Council, or what's being advised in London, and what's happening in Scotland. And in a way, those two papers are linked in that respect. One, preparations for the Union of the Crowns, the other one responding to the restoration pressures. Is there any evidence in appointments or in the particular processes that you've seen where there is a kind of Anglo-Scottish element to what's going on? I mean, for example, is Montrose seen in the 1590s a safe pair of hands from an English perspective, or, if you like, the English party that would support James in the succession? Has he got any? I mean, you're saying he has no noticeable political views. Surely he must have political views.
This is the intriguing thing about him. He's not particularly prominent, but he was briefly a Ruthven Raider, then he left them, and he was with the king by the time the Ruthven regime fell. He was briefly Chancellor under the Arran regime, and that only lasted a few. Did I say Chancellor? I meant Treasurer under the Arran regime, and that fizzled out. He was involved with Huntly and Errol and Angus in their rebellions in the late 1580s, early 1590s, but disassociated himself from them pretty quickly when, you know, and he was a friend of Morton, and then he was involved in Morton downfall, and he just seemed one of these guys who
Don't think you trust.
Yeah. But on the other hand,
Everyone can work with.
yeah, exactly. Nobody can trust and everyone can work with, or nobody can trust and everyone can trust, because if you put them in a prominent enough position and nobody trusts them, then they have to become trustworthy in a sense. I guess. I don't know. But I see no particular reason why, in relation to your specific question, why anyone at the heart of government in late 1590s England would have thought, well, hey, Montrose is Chancellor. Or equally, they would have thought, oh no, Montrose is Chancellor. They probably thought, who? As we've sort of established already. But so there remains a lot of uncertainty around that. I mean, it might be possible, as I said, I've not looked at state papers yet. I would have liked to, but I ran out of time in advance of today. I'm going to scour them and see what they're saying about it, if anything. But,
I suspect the English reaction will be, thank goodness it wasn't Huntly.
Yeah.
Or indeed Errol.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Well, look, I mean, that's a good point for us to break. I mean, I would say that, as I said at the start, before you came out, that many of these papers are work in progress, and that we're looking to kind of build on things, perhaps with Alan Kennedy's exception, who is already published in this area. But anyway, thank you both very much. Excellent.